All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this book launch event for Professor Mark Spencer's new book, The Irreducibility of the Human Person, a Catholic Synthesis. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the founder and president of the Hildebrand Project, and I'm delighted to be here with you in this, and also this very distinguished panel. Today really could not be a more fitting day for a book event like this. Today is the 133rd birthday of Dietrich von Hildebrand and the 131st birthday of St. Edith Stein. So a great day for the release of a book or the promotion of a book devoted to the tradition of Christian personalism. One of the key purposes of the Hildebrand Project is not just the promotion and the recovery of the thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand and other great personalists like St. Edith Stein. It's also to perpetuate and develop this tradition. And I think Mark Spencer's book is a terrific example of this perpetuation and development, and at the same time, a wonderful example of bringing this tradition into dialogue with the broader Catholic intellectual tradition as well. So without further ado, I just want to say a few words about our speakers, and then we'll go right to our presentation. So Professor Mark Spencer, our author, our featured author here, is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He's the assistant editor of the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, and he's a fellow for aesthetics and metaphysics with the Hildebrand Project. And we're just delighted to be able to help present this very significant work of his. In order of presentation, we will hear from our three panelists. First, from Professor Mirela Oliva, who's a professor of philosophy at the Center for Thomistic Studies at the other University of St. Thomas, this one being in Houston, Texas. Mirela is a past participant in a Hildebrand Project colloquium, so we've had a chance to get to know her, and just delighted to be able to have you back, Mirela. Then we'll be hearing from Professor John Crosby. Most people, I think, know that there's a relation to me, but in any case, Professor Crosby is now Professor Emeritus at Franciscan University of Steubenville. He is the co-founder of the Hildebrand Project and a distinguished scholar and very significant collaborator of the Hildebrand Project. And he was a student of Dietrich von Hildebrand for the last 11 years of von Hildebrand's life, and so brings an unparalleled knowledge and personal contact with the thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Finally, we'll hear from Professor Larry Feingold, who's a professor of theology and philosophy at Kennrick-Glennon Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. And Professor Feingold is also a past participant in a Hildebrand Project colloquium. And Larry, we're also just delighted to have you back with us. So the format will be some opening remarks from Mark Spencer on themes of the book, the reason for writing the book. Then we'll hear for about 10 minutes from each of our panelists, and then we'll go to conversation first among the panelists, and then we'll be opening the conversation to all of you. The way that you can participate is to submit your questions through the chat feature, so we'll be looking for those questions. Please keep them coming. We will put them before Mark and our other panelists. A last word, and I'll say it again at the very end, so it's, I guess, a first word, a promotion for the book, is that the book is published through Catholic University of America Press. And in our chat, we will have a discount code where any of you who don't have the book yet can acquire it for a discount of, I think, 20% from Catholic University. It's, of course, also available on Amazon and wherever else books are sold. And so what Mark can't do, I'm eager to do, which is to plug the book, urge you all to buy it. And this is your chance now to hear all about it. So Mark, let's hear from you first.
Thank you, John Henry, and thanks to the Hildebrand Project for hosting this event and promoting my book. And thank you to John and Larry and Mirela for commenting on this book during this panel session. I want to do three things here to introduce my book. So first, I want to just mention and express the main claims of the book. And then I want to say a little bit about my personal motivations for writing it. And then I want to very briefly walk through what I do in each chapter of the book. So first, the main claims of the book. This book is a defense of the claim that we human persons are irreducible to anything non-personal. That is, what I am is a person. I'm not nothing but a material thing, a body, a soul, a body and a soul, a collection of atoms, a mere individual, a part of society, a part of God. I'm not reducible to any of those things. a person is a whole, distinct from all of those things. And sort of the slogan for the book is from Thomas Aquinas: person is what is most perfect in all of nature. Now, furthermore, in the book, I argue that not only are whole persons irreducible to anything non-personal, but we have many irreducible parts, powers, and principles in us. And to fully perceive our irreducibility as persons, we must grasp each of our irreducible aspects. For example, our intellects are not reducible to our senses. Our feelings are not reducible to our passions. Our consciousness is not reducible to our bodies. Our bodies are not reducible to just being expressions of our soul. And so on and so forth. There are many, many aspects of persons that are not reducible to other aspects of persons. And we need to grasp each of those. And I try to express something about each of these non-reducible aspects of the person in my book. Furthermore, I think that we can best perceive our irreducibility by bringing together, synthesizing many different strands of philosophy and theology. All Catholic philosophers and theologians have expressed human irreducibility in some way. But I also think that most Catholic philosophers and theologians have tended to be reductionistic about persons in some way, to not fully express our irreducibility. And so I think by bringing together different accounts, different theories from within the Catholic tradition, we can better see our irreducibility, better see all that there is to being a person. For example, I bring together in the book strands of Catholic philosophy and theology that emphasize experience, like phenomenology and personalism, with theories that emphasize metaphysics and objective explanations, like Thomism and Scotism. And I bring those together with still other strands of the Catholic tradition that do both, that focus on both experience and objective explanations, like the Eastern Christian tradition. And I bring all these together using a method that allows us to see the findings of each particular tradition as parts of a larger whole. And this method is the aesthetic method, which I find in, especially in Hans Urs von Balthasar. This method allows us to perceive the whole human person and each of the different theories' findings as different perspectives upon that larger whole. The final claim of the book, the sort of culmination of the book that I argue towards, is that if the person is really irreducible, then no concept and no definition could fully capture what it is to be a person. Rather, to grasp the person holistically and irreducibly requires us to perceive persons, to perceive them as wholes. This means, I think, that ultimately the best account of persons is an aesthetic account. Persons are a kind of beauty, where beauty names what is holistically and pleasingly self-manifesting, a splendid whole, irreducible to its parts, which is important in itself and requires a response of love and reverence, and which must be perceived with all of one's powers working together. So my ultimate account of persons in this book is a portrait, a picture of the beauty of human persons. Let me now say just a little bit about my motivations personally in writing this book. Ultimately, although I do a lot of theoretical work in this book is an attempt to express my own experiences of irreducible persons. For example, in falling in love with my wife, in many deep friendships that I've been privileged to have in my life, in the experience of raising my children, I've been struck again and again by the beauty and dignity and irreducibility of persons. And I wanted to express that experience philosophically. I want to convey a sense of awe and wonder and reverence at the beauty of persons and at the beauty of reality more generally. Another part of my motivation in writing this book is that I've worked during my career in a wide range of Catholic philosophies and theologies, and I've been repeatedly struck by how many truths each one of them captures. But I've also been struck by how each one of them leaves out crucial truths about persons. And I've been very dismayed at how partisans of different schools of Catholic thought tend to oppose one another and denigrate one another. And I wanted to see if it's possible to synthesize and harmonize large aspects, at least, of many different schools of thought, rather than leave them at odds with each other. So this book is meant to be an example of one way forward for Catholic philosophy and theology. And then finally, I think that philosophy isn't just supposed to give good arguments or prove true conclusions. Rather, I think ultimately philosophy is supposed to train our perception. It's supposed to allow us to see the world, and especially the beauty of the world, as it truly is, and thereby allow us to contemplate the world. The end goal of philosophy and theology is contemplation, which is our highest act. And I wanted to convey a sense of the beauty that I perceive in the world and contribute to this work of perception training. So that's another goal of the book. Let me close by just very briefly mentioning how the book is organized and what I do in each chapter. So I begin with an introduction where I introduce the main methodologies of the book. So that's the phenomenological method, especially drawn from realist phenomenologists like Dietrich von Hildebrand. The scholastic metaphysical method, especially drawn from Thomas Aquinas. And then Hans Urs von Balthasar's aesthetic method, his method of perceiving beauty. And then after that, the book is divided into two parts. The first part has 6 chapters. And there I'm focusing in on different aspects of the person. So I've got chapters on subjectivity, on our bodily powers, especially our senses, on the intellect, on the will and freedom, on affectivity, feeling, and on the nature of human action in itself. And along the way, I touch on a range of metaphysical and theological themes, and I introduce a number of key Catholic intellectual debates. And I try to offer new solutions to each of those debates that synthesizes together different sides of those debates. So even if like the human person isn't your primary interest, there's a lot I think in this book that will interest you because I touch on a lot of different things. And that's because you can't really grasp the human person fully unless you grasp our relationship to lots of other things. Our relationship to God, to the angels, to other living things, to artifacts, technology, stories, morality, being and value in themselves. So I have a lot to say about each of those things, and I offer a metaphysical account of each one of them in connection to human activity. And I offer solutions or attempts at solutions to some key problems in Catholic thought, like the problem of how we come to know the natural law, what the human end is, how states are related to the common good, how our freedom is related to God's causality, how a simple God can relate to us, what the relationship is between essence and existence, what the relationship is between essence and activities, and between being and value, sort of core metaphysical debates in Catholic thought. And then in the second book, I bring together all the stuff that I talked about in the first part of the book, and I do that in 3 chapters. So here I'm trying to paint a portrait of the irreducibility of the person as a whole. And so I introduce an account of what personhood means, especially in terms of beauty. And I explore how we're irreducible to either bodies alone or souls alone. And I consider also how we're not just unified substances, but we include many substances within our bodies. And then finally, I focus on how we're called to both transcend our bodies and incarnate spiritual acts in our bodies. And I close with an account of the resurrected body and its liturgical life, where all of our spiritual acts will be fully incarnated in our bodies. And so that's what I do in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. A great undertaking, a grand undertaking. Mirela.
Yes. So my comments will focus on how Mark Spencer's book is developing the Aristotelian paradigm of life as self-movement. So I have a couple of comments on the overall paradigm, and then in the second part of the comments, I will focus on the issue of causality. Mark Spencer's book starts from the idea that the human person is a living being and thus has an inner dynamism that is specific to all living beings. Spencer continues a line of phenomenological thinkers who revisited Aristotle's notion of life in the first part of the 20th century. Heidegger, Arendt, Stein, Jonas. For Aristotle, life is a special type of movement, namely a self-movement. The movement of our blood, our eyelids, our desires, our thinking is not determined by any external agent. It occurs through an intrinsic principle, which for Aristotle is the soul. Phenomenologists reproposed this Aristotelian view of life's spontaneity against the mechanistic and positivist view of science in the 19th century. In the meantime, contemporary science became open to alternatives to the mechanistic model, and some contemporary biologists or philosophers of science are now welcoming Aristotle's paradigm. Spencer's book might interest in this sense not only phenomenologists and Aristotelians, including, of course, neo-Aristotelians like Thomists, but also those working on the living nature of human personhood. There are a few important consequences that Spencer draws from this basic Aristotelian definition of life. First, because a living being is constituted by self-movement, there is always something going on in the human person. Indeed, the person depicted by Spencer is extremely active. The entire book reads like an action report. Human powers are seeking to be actualized, interact with each other, or interact with external objects. The person is not just the bearer of certain properties, such as rationality, but the abundant source of countless acts. A sense of vitality is present in all human acts. For instance, sensations reveal a holistic sense of intense life, ardor, strength, and health. Acts of will arise from an interior abundance of free actuality and vital strength. Second, self-movement grants living beings a certain independence from the environment because their vital acts occur to an inner principle. The more self-moving powers a living being has, the more independent it becomes. The human person has the highest number of powers, including spiritual ones, that other living beings do not have. However, precisely because independent, human persons also interact with their environment and transcend themselves in many ways. A being pulsating with life is not opaque to its environment. Spencer captures very well this paradox of self-movement as he describes human acts. The vegetative powers, for instance, take in and metabolize food from the environment. Through their powers' interaction with the environment, humans actively fit themselves into their environment. This double dynamism, inner movement and outward interaction, leads to self-manifestation and self-transcendence. Thus, Spencer writes, I quote from page 101, flowers are given and oriented to expressing a plenitude and beauty that exceeds what is necessary for individual or species survival. Vegetative powers transcend themselves toward sensible expressions in a way that guides their substance's natural formation. Likewise, a child's growth conveys a sense of beauty that rightly fills their parents with awe. Powers in this sense are not only oriented to actualizing themselves, but also to manifest the whole person. This leads Spencer to propose the aesthetic cognition as an access to the unity of the living person. Beauty conveys the vitality and self-manifestation of the person as a whole. This original aesthetic approach does justice to the Aristotelian paradigm of life and highlights the role of the phenomenological approach to philosophical anthropology. In the last part of my comments, I'd like to zoom in on the structure of vital acts. Spencer masterfully shows how human acts involve causal powers. This insight represents a long-needed correction to a large part of phenomenology that is adverse to causality. This aversion is due, I believe, partly to Hume's influence and partly to a reliance on the mechanistic model of causality promoted by modern science. For Heidegger and other phenomenologists, causation is not a genuine phenomenon, but a scientific construct that composes a deterministic worldview. What better rebuttal of this misunderstanding than a description of causality in the midst of life's spontaneity? At the same time, Spencer relies on the phenomenological notion of meaning to describe some forms of causality that stem from the spiritual core of the human being. Indeed, the Aristotelian tradition of causation did not sufficiently describe immaterial causation. Thus, Spencer's book corrects phenomenology with Aristotle and enriches Aristotle with phenomenology. In his causal description, Spencer employs Aristotle's fourfold causal model: the efficient, formal, final, and material cause. From the outset, he indicates that the self-movement of a living being is teleological, that is oriented to a final cause, namely the perfection of its own nature. While final causality orients human vitality, efficient causality is the engine of all acts. For instance, vegetative powers, efficient new act potencies, unities, drawing out or educing actualities from the potentiality of matter. When causation involves an immaterial being, Spencer replaces the term causation with motivation and being moved. In such cases, he adds the mediation of meaning to what he calls mere causation. I take that for Spencer, motivation is still a form of causation, although he does not fully clarify it. Motivation is a spiritual type of causation that engages a person's spiritual core in response to objective non-material beings. Affective and intellectual acts are imbued with meaning. Thus, Spencer writes, being moved by beauty, falling in love, prideful hatred, reverence and adoration, pain, anxiety and distraction are not just bodily effects. This is because, although they involve being moved by their objects, they are meaningful, intentional, self-conscious acts, and some have immaterial beings, being as such, or being's property as their objects. They are motivated by modes of importance. They arise only upon grasping their objects' meanings and are not merely caused in us without our having to grasp their objects' meaning. This sort of immaterial causation is involved also in social and creative acts. For instance, a conversation's unity is not reducible to the sum of the individuals who partake in it and act as efficient causes. Rather, it is also caused by the value at stake in the conversation, which acts as a final and formal cause. Spencer calls these wholes that involve several causes with the German term gestalten. In gestalten, material causes are intertwined with immaterial ones. The causality at work here is different from the scholastic per se or per accidens causality. In per se causation, we directly cause our acts and orient them toward definite effects. For instance, we per se cause our acts of breathing or seeing. In causation per accidens, we cause an unintended effect. For instance, if we dig a hole to plant a tree and discover a treasure in the ground, this discovery is an unintended effect and we cause it by accidents. However, the causation occurring in gestalten is neither per se nor per accidens, but a complex intertwining of material and immaterial causes that Spencer calls causality per communione. In this case, he writes, values and gestalten cannot efficaciously act except through their constituent substances' efficient causality, but they give new meaning to substances and draw substances to new goals, acting by formal and final causality. So, thank you. These are my comments.
Thank you, Mirela. Dr. Crosby.
All right, very good. Let me begin with a very general observation about this book of Mark's. It seems to me that it is the kind of book that would typically be written by a philosopher at the end of his career, not at the beginning of it. The book is not just about a particular issue concerning the human person. It searches for a holistic vision of the person. It's not based on one tradition, such as Thomism or phenomenology, but on the interweaving of several traditions. Thus, Spencer offers us an extraordinarily comprehensive study of the human person. It would be a remarkable accomplishment as the capstone of a philosopher's life's work. But Mark Spencer gives it to us as his first book. I'm amazed to find a work of so far-ranging work and so many layered work written by so young a philosopher. Now, my plan is to point out two ideas in Mark's book that caught my attention, resonated with me strongly, and seemed to me of great importance. Then I will ask Mark to expand on these two ideas. First, Mark lays great stress on the fact that we creaturely persons exist with a being of our own. For instance, it is reductionistic, he says, to affirm that the whole being of us persons consists in our being related to others. He says, I quote him on page 312, I am not reducible to relations. I also subsist in myself. Although I receive myself from God and world, I then have myself as my own. Scotus calls the person the furthest solitude, ultima solitudo. Nothing is more self-possessed, given over to him or herself, than a person. Although I am intrinsically related to others, I am also alone with myself. End of that quote. Mark also shows that this being of our own is found even in our relation to God. A few pages later, we read, and I quote, the return we make to God must include something of our own if we are to be God's partners and not just his humiliated, even if happy, subjects. This requires that we be given to ourselves such that we are, as Levinas says, separate from him and have something of our own to give. End of that quote. Mark works this idea out further when he discusses the relation between our free will and the God who causes our entire being. He sees in the Catholic tradition no lack of authors who affirm the sovereignty of God so strongly that the freedom of the human person is compromised. These authors end up denying that we ever act with an acting of our own. They end up thinking that our acting is nothing but a matter of God acting in and through us. Such authors, Mark says, are guilty of a grievous reductionism. They assert the power of God at the expense of the freedom of the human person. Mark knows how to give God his due as creator while explaining how God leaves us a space to act with an acting that is really our own acting. When Mark comes to speak of the beauty of each person, he means to present us with a beauty that is proper to or intrinsic to each person. Yes, of course, the beauty derives from God and shows forth the grandeur of God, but it is still a beauty that really belongs to each person, so that in being moved to love a person in virtue of his or her beauty, I love that very person. I don't just love God instead of that person. Mark would surely reject as reductionistic the well-known view of Negrin, who says that God, with his agape love for human persons, loves them in an entirely unmotivated way and does not respond to anything of beauty in them. God allegedly loves us at his own inscrutable initiative, but not on the basis of a beauty intrinsic to a person. Mark vindicates in many places in his book this intrinsic beauty proper to persons, along with the intrinsic being proper to us as creaturely persons. I'd like to ask Mark to say more about why the portrait of the human person requires us to do full justice to the being of our own that's proper to each person. Tell us more, Mark, about the motives, which are often deeply religious motives, that lead people to belittle this being of our own. And while you're at it, tell us more about the danger of exaggerating this being of our own. And now, for the second main idea that I want to point out in Mark's book and ask him about. Years ago, Joseph Seifert made an important distinction that I think never received its due. Mark has picked up this distinction and makes frequent use of it, building much of his analysis on it. It is the distinction among three dimensions of being. Seifert says that there are three fundamental ways in which a being can be, as it were, lifted out of nothingness. There is, firstly, being in the sense of intelligible being, that is, being in the sense of essence and form and meaning. There is, secondly, being in the sense of substance, that is, being in the sense of esse and actuality. And thirdly, finally, there is being in the axiological sense of value, or in the sense of being worthy to be. So, am I correct? I want to ask. Am I correct, Mark, that you think it would be reductionistic to rely only on the first two dimensions of being in reflecting on the human person? and also reductionistic to think that the third dimension, the dimension of worthiness to be, is contained in the second dimension, the dimension of actuality. Am I correct that you mean to build much of your analysis in what follows in your book on this tripartite distinction? I was particularly struck by your idea of a certain receptivity that is possible in the third dimension of being. You describe it as an open welcoming of beings, persons, and values, a kind of receptivity possible even in God. And this you contrast with the more passive kind of undergoing which occurs in the second dimension of being. Can you unpack this idea further so that this new kind of receptivity available even to God becomes clearer to us? And one more thing, and with this I end. You say that the privation theory of evil is valid in the second dimension of being, but not in the third. On page 283, you say that, and I quote, "At the third level of being, evil and other disvalues have positive reality." And that quote. This sounds right to me, but I'd be glad to hear you say more about this new aspect of evil, this more than privative aspect that arises within the setting of the third dimension of being. Those are my thoughts and my questions for Mark.
Okay. Larry.
Okay. Well, I'd like to echo John Crosby's opening remark. I too was really struck by the fact that this book really shows a maturity that in taking in so many different aspects, and that and as you, Mark, mentioned in the beginning, your contemplative goal, that shines through in this book. And it makes the reader, so I want to urge the reader to pick up this book and to read it more than once. So I've read it twice, and I feel like I'm just on the surface of so many of the debates that you mentioned. And then secondly, I like to I thought I would speak about your method, but I think you did a great job, Mark, in your opening presentation, but I still want to go back to it. So in any work, obviously method is very important, and you want a method to be suited to your subject matter. And so I think that was beautifully the case here. Since your subject matter is the human person and all its irreducibility, you have to bring in all of these different perspectives precisely to bring out what they see about that irreducibility, but also how their limitation and potentially reductionistic aspect can be overcome by an opposing point of view. So often we tend to view these opposing methodologies and approaches as a kind of partisan warfare. And this, I think, is, we have a term in theology, odium theologicum, right? Between the theological hate between different theological and philosophical schools. And it's so refreshing to find a work that doesn't engage in odium theologicum, but seeks to bring together unlikely partners and make them speak to one another, not directly, but through your book. And so I thought that was very appropriate to the subject matter, but also that's how we get to wisdom, I think, is precisely bringing together approaches that seem mutually exclusive, but they're in reality complementary, right? To bring that complementary. And so there's a symphonic aspect to this book, right? That has a richness from the different views that you bring together. And then third, the subtitle is A Catholic Synthesis. And so I think this method of bringing together these different views enables it to be Catholic in the small c sense of the word. In other words, really seeking a universality, but also Catholic in the big C sense, drawing on so many different strands of Catholic thought, and then making a synthesis that no one of them could do by themselves. And working for a kind of Catholic unity, right? In other words, to bring Thomists and phenomenologists, Scotists and Thomists, Gregory Palamas you bring in and in so many different places, unlikely or new natural law and traditional natural law theorists. The juxtaposition is very enriching. That's the first thing. And then the aesthetic method, also very beautifully suited to the subject matter, right? To bring out precisely the beauty of the human person by focusing on the holistic. In other words, beauty has this holistic aspect, the harmony of irreducible parts. And so it's a method that absolutely needs to be used to get at the irreducibility of the human person. I think you do that marvelously, and I hope to come back to that at the end of my remarks. So I'd like to go into a couple of the debates. So again, as Mark said in the beginning, he doesn't shy away from addressing the most debated questions, right? And so there are questions in the Catholic tradition that are like nodal problems that come up again and again, century after century, because there's a richness to the problem, and the different approaches no one of them succeeds in resolving it, right? And so among these nodal problems, I mean, there are tons of these nodal problems that you've addressed. Again, that makes it very audacious, but I think you, at least in all of those debates that I know something about, I found in your work a way of bringing together things that I hadn't seen before. So let me start with the debate that I know the best, and that is the natural desire to see God. So I wrote my dissertation on this in a book on it. But I thought the way you addressed this was very interesting. So the method would be to listen to the opposing sides in the debate for what they get right about the richness, and then also how they might be reductionistic. And so with regard to a natural desire to see God, denying such an openness, right, denying that we have that, clearly would be reductionistic. And one could have a naturalistic reductionism, right? Man is just prisoned to the empirical level. But then you take those that very strongly affirm a natural desire to see God and making it an absolute desire, something here, the Nouvelle Théologie, theologians like Henri de Lubac. And you see a danger of a certain reduction there, reducing man precisely to a natural desire to see God, as if that were simply our nature. And so you go back and kind of take an element from the Thomistic tradition here, obediential potency, that was very strongly criticized by the Nouvelle Théologie, people like Henri de Lubac, as being potentially reductionistic. But you show precisely how it's so obediential potency is the capacity of the human person to be elevated by God directly, but you bring, it doesn't have to be God. In other words, the ability of the human person to be moved by, elevated by another, God, or even creatures, taking us beyond our natural proportionality. And so you take that notion, right? So denying an obediential potency for elevation would be reductionistic, right? That openness to being elevated by God, to share in his life, but also being elevated by, say, beautiful objects, beautiful persons, also have a way of elevating. And then you apply it as well, Mark, to value. And I thought that was really interesting. So picking up on what Dr. Crosby was speaking about, that question about the three modes of being and the axiological, that third mode, and bringing in obediential potency there, I thought that was really interesting, and connecting it also to the perception of beauty as well. I actually did a word count, and you speak about obediential potency something like 150 times during the course of the book in many different discussions. And I thought that was a really interesting way of taking this Thomistic category, but using it in a phenomenological way, in an axiological way. And another nodal debate, which I don't have time to go into because I want to leave time for Mark to speak, but was that got alluded to by Dr. Crosby, is precisely the question of freedom and grace, right? So that the De Auxiliis controversy, one of the most protracted, bitter disputes of partisan theological warfare. So you again have the courage to address and offer your own solution to. I thought that was very well done. And again, a solution that takes place in different chapters and brings in so many different strands. So on the one hand, I think you show, how both sides in this debate in the late 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, have a danger of reducing certain aspects, right? And precisely human freedom. And so I just want to second the idea that Dr. Crosby spoke about of how we're not reducible to divine causality. And I love the way you bring in the notion of causality per communionem that Mirela mentioned. In other words, a kind of causality that works in which a cooperation brings forth something new, right? And then you also bring in from the Palamite tradition, energeia, so a distinction of essence and energies, but then you bring in a category, sun energeia, to, I don't know how to translate that, but well, you leave it untranslated. So in other words, a way of actualization with others that again is part of our richness, that capacity to have an actuality that's cooperative and participatory with God and with in society, socially. And so I was very struck by the way you dealt with that issue. And then I love the last chapter. So the last chapter, kind of culminating this portrait of the beauty of the human person on the resurrected body and the resurrection. And so Mark uses this notion of the face, prosopon, and so our face being the most expressive part, and the idea that in the resurrection, we shall be all face. I think, so just pastorally speaking, it's really difficult, I find, to get people excited about heaven, right? So and I think this is a fundamental challenge for us in the new evangelization, right? How to speak about heaven and the life of heaven in a way that gets to people's experience. This worked for me, to want to see the whole of persons who become all face in the resurrection. And you connect it with the liturgy here already on earth, right? So in the liturgy, and especially in the Eucharist, there's an aspect in, well, that's what it's all about, the liturgy, is to make other material elements, sacramental elements, and our prayer all face in a way, anticipating and pointing to the goal of heavenly beatitude. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that. And I think we have some time for Mark.
Well, thank you, Larry. And Mark, you have some rich comments to respond to. So why don't we begin with what you have to say, and we'll see how much time we have. And certainly some of you have used the Q&A feature to submit questions. Please continue to do so. Depending on the flow of things, we'll try to get to some of them. But again, put your questions into the Q&A feature here in Zoom. But Mark.
Well, thank you to all of you. Thank you, Mirela and John and Larry. And I really appreciate you reading my book and commenting on it, and the very kind and humbling things that you said. You are three people that I've learned from a great deal. So I'm especially honored that you said these things about my book. Let me just say a little bit about each of the things that you said. So I want to focus in, Mirela, on the contrast that you drew between the Aristotelian and phenomenological vision of life that I try to portray in this book with a mechanistic view. I try to keep this book sort of focused on Catholic theories. I say a little bit about why reductionistic theories like materialism, I say a good deal about why reductionistic theories like materialism and dualism and things like this are false. But my focus here is on portraying the human person as a whole, so that we can really get the human person in view. But I think you're right to focus in on contrasting my view of life with a mechanistic view. If there's sort of one view that I think is the absolute worst when it comes to reductionistic theories, it would be a sort of mechanistic worldview. If I've got sort of one target, that's the one. Rather, I'm trying to portray a view on which our paradigm for thinking about the world as a whole, right, sort of the standard we look to, is not the machine, which is what it is on the mechanistic worldview, but persons. All other things are analogous to persons, and we can best grasp what plants and animals and non-living things and even machines really are by analogy to persons and to the sort of spontaneous life that persons display. And much as I love the Aristotelian tradition and am deeply rooted in it, there's a tendency sometimes in that view for things to sound a little mechanistic. And so that's why I think the phenomenologists who draw on Aristotle are helpful, that this inner self-motion is not just sort of pure conceptualizable causality, but it's vitality. Right? It's the feeling of life. And I want to convey that feeling of life in what I write about it. Second thing I want to speak to within your reflections is this contrast I draw, well, really just a contrast I take from Dietrich von Hildebrand between motivation and mere causation. And I want to say, yes, both of these are forms of causality. Right? If causality is giving existence to another, both mere causation, the sort of causation that we find in non-living, non-conscious things, where one event gives rise to another, and motivation, the sort of giving of existence to our acts that we have when we engage in free acts and intellectual acts and feelings. Both of these are kinds of causality, but motivated acts are sort of, again, the paradigm for causality. The fullest sense of giving existence to another comes when I act in a meaningful, self-conscious, self-directed, self-determined sort of way, where my act flows from me, and it flows from me because I've grasped some meaning, and that motivates my act. So that's sort of the standard for causality. All other instances of causation are analogous to that one, but that one which we grasp in our own acts is the standard. So again, I want to paint a portrait of reality, give a picture of reality on which persons are the standard, and everything else needs to be understood by analogy to them. Dr. Crosby, again, also thank you. And Dr. Crosby was one of my earliest teachers in philosophy, and I've learned an immense amount from him. And I'm deeply grateful for everything that you said. You asked me a lot of questions. I don't know if I can answer them all adequately. I can't answer them all adequately here, but I'll say a little bit about each one. So you first focused in on my preoccupation with sort of carving out a space for persons having being and beauty and freedom and causality of their own. We are not reducible to our relationships to other persons. Although we are relations to other persons at a very fundamental level, that's not all that we are. And we are not reducible to our relations to God. Although again, our relations to God are of the utmost importance and belong to us at a very fundamental level. But in addition to our relations to other persons and to God, we have being of our own. So you asked me, why is this so important on my account of the human person, that we do justice to this, this being of our own? My fundamental motivation for focusing in on this comes through my experience of freedom. To be free, to be able to determine the course of my own life it seems to me, involves at least two aspects that require my freedom to be in my own hands and not be at the disposal of another, even God. The first is to be free is to be called to responsibility. Because I act here in a intelligible, meaningfully motivated way, in a way in which I produce my act, I cause my act. I'm responsible for my act, for its outcomes. But if my being is entirely at the disposal of another, if I'm nothing but my relationships to society or to other persons, or if I'm nothing but an instrument of God, then I'm not ultimately responsible. And yet it's sort of fundamental to our experience of free action that we are responsible. That's sort of an immediately given feature of experience. It would be hard to make sense of nearly anything that human beings do if we were not responsible, morally speaking. But for me to be responsible, my acts, my causality, my being, myself, needs to be my own. So that sort of is a taste of some of the methodology that I use in the book too, before I turn to the second thing that's important here. I'm trying to give an account of the human person that's very true to our experience. Let's see if we can build a metaphysical model in which we don't deny or explain away significant features of our experience. And I don't know of anything more fundamental to my experience of myself than the experience of being free. And so that's something I want to retain at all costs. A theory that required me to give that up seems like by that very fact is a false theory. And I want to hold on to that experience even if it's hard to explain that. We should not give up on key features of our experience just because it's hard to see how they fit into a larger metaphysical model. The second feature of our experience that I want to retain, and that leads me to say that we have our being of our own, goes right along with responsibility. The highest sorts of acts that I can freely do are acts of self-gift. And in particular, in the religious life, I find myself called to make a gift of myself back to God. God does not just appropriate me, doesn't just force me to act in certain ways, but calls me to make a gift of myself back to him. But for me to make a gift of myself, I have to have myself at my disposal. And so I need to have a being and beauty and causality of my own such that I can make that gift back to God. You asked, why do some people deny that we have being of our own for religious motives? And I think you touched on it. That is, it's a focus on the sovereignty of God, a recognition that God is the first cause and the primary cause of all things, and that nothing other than God exists except by dependence upon God. But I think then there's a tendency to join that completely true recognition of the absolute sovereignty and transcendence and primacy of God. There's a tendency to try to explain that using models that are not well suited to modeling the relationships between persons. So, for example, a tendency to try to explain that in something like a mechanistic way, in which God is sort of the driver of the whole machine of the universe, and all the other motions within the universe, including our acts, move because God moves them in that way. And there are other models, I think, also in which we try to take true, completely valid observations about our own experience or about our relationship to God and fit them into that model, and we end up getting false results. So again, I think the model of how we are related to God and to his causality needs to be modeled personalistically, right, through the lens of our actual first-person experience. And then finally, you asked, what dangers does it pose focusing in on our own being, this idea that we have being of our own? And I think the danger that it poses is there could be a tendency to overlook what freedom is called to do, right? This call to self-gift. That although I have my being at my own disposal, it's not given to me to hold on to. Right? I find myself called by the importances or the values that I find in things to make a gift of myself, to go outside myself, to focus on others, to make a gift of myself to them, and above all to God. And I think a lot of people who have focused well on the experience of having our being at our own disposal have overlooked or denied this feature of our experience, the call to self-gift. I draw in the chapter on freedom on the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who I think describes aspects of freedom extremely well and then disastrously overlooks this feature of persons. So there is a great danger there in focusing in on our freedom, and it needs to be balanced by these other aspects of personhood. Second, Dr. Crosby, you called attention to my use of Joseph Seifert's threefold distinction of different levels of being, the essences or intelligible being, real being or actual being, and then value, or the important in itself. And I certainly want to defend the view that that values, these properties by which things have importance in their own right, are not reducible to what I call ontological actualities, the forms and essences and existence and accidents that we observe in beings. To say that something is important in itself, or to say that it has a kind of importance, like that it's beautiful, or that it's just, or that it's holy, or that it's charitable, or any other sort of value term that we can make, this is to make a sort of judgment about the being as a whole. When something shows up as beautiful, all of its accidents, its substance, its essences, all of those ontological features of the being are taken up into a larger whole, and a judgment is made about them. These things are beautiful. These things are just. These things are holy. And there we have an aspect of what is given in experience that needs to be accounted for, but that's not reducible to essences and accidents and other observable features of beings. Again, what I want to do in this book is build a metaphysical model that is true to all aspects of our experience. And it seems to me that when we are responsive to these values, when I encounter something beautiful and I receive that beauty, and I am motivated to have reverence and awe for that beauty, I'm doing something very different than when, say, something in the world acts upon me, gives me a new perfection. When I respond to the beauty of things, I'm going out of myself towards that other thing. I am not, in a sense, being perfected in my own right. Rather, I am being taken out of myself towards another. So there's a level to experience that doesn't involve sort of metaphysical perfection, becoming more human. It's a distinct kind of experience. And that's why I think we can admit a sort of receptivity in God without saying that God is passive, or that God is actualized by creatures, or that God has potential, God is pure act. But to say that God is pure act is to make a claim at that second level of being, the level of existence and actuality. To speak of God's responsiveness to creation is to speak at a different level. And I think once we make these distinctions between the ontological level, the level of existence and actuality, and this more experiential or phenomenological or axiological level, and we admit both of those in our metaphysics, now a sort of space has opened up where we can make the sorts of claims that people normally make about God, like that God loves us and is responsive to our prayers and stuff like that, without having to deny the equally true metaphysical conclusions we've come to about God, that God is simple, that God is pure act. Those metaphysical claims are claims about the second level of being. The other claims are claims about the experiential level of being. And I try to do some things in the book to show how those two levels are related to one another. And then I think that also accounts for my attempt at a solution to this debate about the privation theory of evil. To say that something is evil at the second level of being, at the level of accidents and substance and so forth, is to say that it's lacking something that it ought to have. But to say that something evil, experientially speaking, is to say that it sort of exerts a kind of force on us. It displays a sort of malevolence that shows up in our experience as something that calls for repudiation and calls for rejection. So by relegating that to this third level of being, I want to have a place in my metaphysics for the very positive experience of beauty, or of evil that we all encounter. That's way too cursory. There's a lot more that I could say, and a lot more I do say in the book about those questions that you raised, Dr. Crosby. Let me turn to Larry's remarks, and I'm glad that the sort of ironic tone of the book came across so well, and I'm grateful to you for focusing in on obediential potency. I learned about the idea of obediential potency from your book. That is where I first encountered it. So thank you for focusing in on that. So yeah, the idea of obediential potency in the scholastic tradition is this this openness that we have to being actualized by God and being drawn above our nature, where nature and natural potencies are to be understood as potentials for actions that are proportioned to us, that fit with us, where I can achieve their objects through my own efforts, right? My potency to eat food, and my potency to see, and my potency to form concepts and so forth. These are all proportioned to me. They fit with me. I can achieve them under my own efforts. But we also find ourselves open to what is greater than ourselves. And the scholastics, or the Thomists especially, focus in on how we are open to being drawn up to a higher level by God. And I'm really struck by this idea of a key feature of the human person is we are open to what is new. We are open to God doing a new work in us. We're also open to other human persons doing a new work in us, something totally unanticipatable, something I cannot achieve by my own efforts. And I really do think those views on which we're just sort of by nature, by our natural potencies, ordered to God or to being as such, or to something that sort of encompasses the whole, fail to take into account these ways in which we are open to something new. And I really want to highlight that openness that we have. At the same time, I want to say we have these obediential potencies by nature. That is sort of from our origins, in the way that God has created us. We are open to what is new, but it's a different kind of openness to the acts that we can perform under our own effort. And I find this language of natural potency and obediential potency immensely helpful for distinguishing these different ways in which human persons are open to what's outside of us, open to transcending ourselves. I think I do I use the term obediential potency and the term obedience in ways probably not envisioned by the Thomistic tradition. But I think there's sort of a seed there that's immensely able to express a lot of experiences in the person. I'll just briefly say also thank you for focusing in, both you and Mirela, thank you for focusing in on this sort of cooperative dimension. I have this idea of sun energia. I guess I'd translate that as something like activity with another. We are open to not just acting as isolated individuals, but our activities genuinely joining together with others. And I think that'll above all happen in the resurrected state, where we will perfectly act with others, where our bodies and our souls will perfectly act together, and that's why we will be all face. And it happens in an initial way here in the liturgy. I'll just close by saying I too sometimes find it hard to get excited about heaven, and I'm glad that this worked for you, Larry, and I hope it does work for other people. Relating heaven to really happy experiences I have now. Not to say that heaven is reducible to those, but seeing it as a fulfillment of really happy experiences I have right now, I think is key. And that's what I try to do there at the end of the book. Thank you to you all, and thank you to the Hildebrand Project for hosting this. Honored by everything that you said.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mark. And I see we've come up more or less to the end of our time, and there's some good questions in here. And I thought maybe I'd try to distill just two of them and see if you can give some quick replies. So the one question, the two questions that sort of touch on similar things regard your aesthetic method and why it's most suited to synthesizing these different dimensions of the person. And then a sort of building on that, there's the question of, while the aesthetic method is very attractive, that one can imagine someone objecting that the method is too synthetic, given the various differences, including deep differences, fundamental differences that exist within these different schools. So how is it possible to utilize the strengths of the conclusions of the schools while avoiding the inconsistencies and differences that exist between them? Maybe you could say a word on that.
Sure, thank you. So first of all, why do I find the aesthetic method helpful? So the aesthetic method, again, is the method of training one's perception to see the holistic beauty of things, in this case, human persons, and also training one's perception so that one can see different claims made about human persons as different perspectives upon a whole. Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's the person I'm above all drawing the method from, has this wonderful section of his major work, The Glory of the Lord, in which he says, okay, we're trying to see the form of God, trying to see what God is like. And we can see within the Christian tradition different perspectives upon this. And so he goes through 12 different exemplars of people who have seen different facets of the beauty of God. People like Dante and John of the Cross and Bonaventure and Gerard Manley Hopkins and different people like this. So we're looking at different perspectives upon one central phenomenon. And the aesthetic method is one where we look at these different perspectives and we try to get a sort of symphonic or stereoscopic vision upon the whole that brings all of those perspectives together. And I think that's helpful, not just for the human person, but for thinking about anything. Each of our conceptual theories, each of our explanatory theories, necessarily focuses in on certain aspects of a thing more than others. That's just how conceptual and rational thought works. And so we're going to focus on some things and we're going to leave other things out. And so it's helpful to have a method, it's necessary, I think, to have a method in which we don't just take things apart, but we put things back together. And we see how all the perspectives give us a view upon one whole. Right? And remember that the whole that we are speaking about, in this case, the human person, is not the same thing as our theories about that whole. So learning to see the form of the whole. So I think it's absolutely necessary here and anywhere, really, if we're really trying to grasp reality. Now, that said, of course, yes, these different traditions make inconsistent claims. And so they cannot all be true in all respects. They're going to have to be wrong in some respects. And so here I think sort of looking to the theory and reasoning about the theory in a very analytic, careful, conceptual, rational sort of way, and then looking back to the phenomenon, sort of checking the theory against our vision of the whole, and allowing each theory to correct our vision of the whole. This sort of back and forth movement is necessary for both seeing the whole, grasping the entirety of the human person, and also correcting the theories against one another. Part of the way I do this is by always returning to experience. Right? If some theory seems to be in tension with what is constantly given in experience, that's a sign that something about that theory is going to need to be given up. Of course, there are other ways of correcting theories if they just make invalid inferences or clearly unsound inferences. Then we give those up as well. But this back and forth movement between particular theory and the whole I think is a helpful method for correcting the deficiencies in each theory.
Mark, I'm gonna treat you like an interviewer on TV with the 15 seconds for this, 30 seconds for that. There's an intriguing question here where someone points out that Mary did not recognize Christ by his appearance, but by his voice. And does this part of the resurrection story illuminate your focus on the face? And I think that's a nice choice of words there on the part of the questioner.
Yeah. Yes. And this metaphor of the face is meant to extend to all aspects of the person. So the voice can become face just as much as the actual physical face can. To say that something is face is to say that the spirit of the person is revealed, and not just revealed, but made present in it. Right. And so when our Lord says to Mary Magdalene, right, calls her name Mary, right, in the speaking of her name, who Christ is made manifest to her. It's present there in the words. And that's the sort of relationship between body and soul that I think we ought to have, and hopefully one day will have.
Very good. And here's your 30-second question. So there's a question in there about whether the book is usable at an undergraduate level. And why don't we tie that to the question about what you think which of the insights in your book into the human person speak most to contemporary American society, particularly at the level of the Catholic in the pew, not necessarily the scholar. So the undergraduate and the lay Catholic.
Yeah. So I think this book would be usable at an upper level, undergraduate level. It would not be usable, I think, at an introductory level, except maybe a few excerpts. But most of it, I think, is probably too technical to be used at the lower undergraduate level. I tried to write it in such a way that any reasonably educated person could read it. But I do recognize I get into some kind of technical metaphysics at times, which might be difficult to teach to the lower level undergraduate. So upper level undergraduates, I think, yes. And then I think that the thing that I would want the person in the pew to focus in most on is my focus on attending to experience. We tend to get lost in theory. Americans are very wedded to our theories, scientific theories especially, and learning to look away from theory and be aware of what you're actually aware of. That's the message I would hope people would take from this book.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you to each of our panelists, Mirela, Larry, Dr. Crosby. Mark, we're delighted to have been able to present this book. The video from this presentation will be posted to our YouTube channel, so check back in the near future. I want to thank, just want to thank you for the work that you've done, Mark. Those of you who are seeing us on social media, please follow us there. If you're not already on our email list, you can be notified of future events. We'd love to see you all again. And thank you to everyone who's joined us, and we wish you all the best. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.